welcome to Mystics and Muons. Today I've got Stephen Fleming on. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
First, I think I first found you. I was searching online, looking into like early Mormonism, mysticism, philosophy. I think I found your dissertation on early Mormonism and Neoplatonism. Is that correct? Yeah, and then I had listened to your presentation at Sunstone last year and found it fascinating. Then we had chatted a bit online. You had presented in the Mormonism and Western Esotericism group. And so, then we got together. And today I think we want to just kind of talk a bit about Plato, Mormonism, but more about your journey and kind of how those all intertwine.
Okay.
Yeah, so why don't you introduce yourself a bit, and then you can kind of take it from there.
Well, where to begin? I got a PhD, religious studies, my history focused, worked on history of Mormonism kind of within the context of history of Christianity. Long story of how I put my dissertation topic together. Discovered I was always really quite interested in history, in religious history. That's probably how I felt. Even kind of being young, found those things fascinating when I was a missionary.
You were born into Mormonism?
Yeah. So my dad, grew up in Utah. My dad, he actually still teaches at BYU. He's in his 80s. Teaches there. He actually started there, I think, the year before I was born. Stuff to say about that, I guess. Had a lot of fascination with those kinds of, which is just religion and stuff. And again, it's a bit of a story, but over, by the time I was getting toward the end of my undergrad, I think the thing that really fascinated me, and again, I was probably still kind of putting this together, but just, I think I would, the longer way of saying it would be, as I believe, I still see it this way. What are the ways in which God puts together the restoration, not just in the immediate happenings, but kind of a grander, more historical context, centuries leading up to things. That idea really fascinated me. I could go through various books that kind of prompted me in that direction. And I've kind of stayed on that, and I guess, the shorter way of putting that is, where's Mormonism come from? But that shorter way can maybe sound perhaps sometimes a bit hostile to some people's faith. Because the more standard answer from believer position is, Mormonism comes from God and Nephites and that kind of stuff, and that kind of thing. Whereas, I see it as a bit more of a historical process. So, I had lots of fascinations that have kind of came together to do that, and I've been really doing that my whole adult life. It's turned out to be, dissertation was a real big project, and that turned out I've now spent twice as long revising the dissertation as I did writing the dissertation. So, I mean, revision doesn't really seem quite the right word if that's what
was your undergrad in?
I did history at BYU. Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of got a smattering of stuff.
And were you when were you first exposed to like philosophy, Plato? Like where did your interest start there?
Well, that's kind of an interesting thing. Yeah. Where did I make that Plato connection?
Just in general, like for me, I remember, interestingly enough, I just pieced this together. I was at BYU. I studied bioinformatics in my undergrad, And I remember there was a time at BYU where I had this huge faith crisis. And I like got it back together and, carried on. But looking back, I remember I was looking back through old files recently, and I realized that faith crisis I had was right after I forget what the course was, but we were reading like Alfred North Whitehead and all these philosophers. And I think it just kind of blew my mind open to thinking about things I had never considered before. And that's actually where I read Plato's Republic and learned about Plato's Cave and stuff. But then I never knew where the trail led from there. And so I was not into philosophy for, a couple decade or so more. So that was my introduction to it. I'm curious, like as a kid, whether any of these topics were on your mind, or were you exposed to it in undergrad?
No, it actually wasn't in undergrad either. It was the germ of that, the seed of that was that interest of wanting to trace things back. And so literally what I did is I kind of went, century by century, group by group, kind of went back, finally to Plato. I was not interested in philosophy at all as an undergrad, or as a master's student, or really much as a PhD student. I know that maybe sounds a little bit funny. So yeah, it went kind of in stages. So like one of the first projects I worked on, I had noticed these connections with religion Methodism. With early Mormons, there's a lot of early Mormons who were Methodists, learned kind of about it. That was an early article I wrote. I wrote it for the, I think called The Religious Educator that BYU puts out, saying, hey, look, I think these are these connections there. And, that's certainly a really, Joseph Smith himself was interested in it, yada, yada, yada. But kind of, there could be these connections with other religions, and they could be seen as a good thing, right? Not such a stark contrast of everything being false kind of a thing. And, you can even find positive statements. And even the idea of the Methodist thing even came, I was sitting in Sunday school back in, I think maybe the first ward my wife and I were in after we got married at BYU. And someone had brought up the question of when, I should know my Mormon history better than this. Is it Lorenzo Stowe or Wilford Woodruff who started doing the baptisms for the dead of the, anyway, in St. George anyway. But there was, I should know that. There was, they baptize all these famous people, right? This one, he has this vision of the founding fathers, right? And then it was interesting. 3 of the people that they baptized, instead of just making them elders, they made them high priests. And someone had brought that up as a little piece of trivia. And one of them, and the 3 were Columbus, George Washington, and John Wesley. So I was thinking, why John Wesley? We don't throw around a ton of praise of him in church. Martin Luther maybe gets more attention, but that actually kind of started it. So again, I think I was an undergrad then. Anyway, started thinking with that a little bit. So just like this tiny little step of, okay, there's something here, and various articles and things that I found kind of useful, saying, okay, there's a context, an historical context from where Mormonism comes from, and I found that really, really fascinating. The huge book that just my whole adult life research was based on is John Brooke's Refiner's Fire. You familiar with that?
Sorry, froze a bit. Which book?
Okay, The Refiner's Fire by John Brooke.
I've read, I've seen passages from it, but I haven't read it.
Okay. That one had a huge influence on me. Even because we were mentioning spiritual experiences, that I had really wanted to do this, but I was I didn't really get into Mormon history until literally my very last project at BYU. When you write your big, as a history major, you write a big paper. And I was interested in history. Actually, wasn't that interested in Mormonism because the way we often present Mormon history, in my opinion, seemed kind of boring. Often very disconnected from other kinds of happenings going on. and I was kind of more interested in more cultural stuff, and some people really do enjoy the disconnect, but that wasn't really my thing. And but yeah, I in my last project, in a book came across Mormons in New Jersey in the 1840s, which I never heard of, but they had some communities there. That became that project. And then that expanded into my master's thesis, not just New Jersey, but kind of the larger Philadelphia area. And then there was the question of, well, what do I do with this? And then there was a real big thing is, okay, who joined and why did they join? Kind of from a sociological standpoint. So kind of worked on that. I thought that was an interesting idea. But yeah. In that process, I came across John Brooke, even though his book had been out, 6-8 years. I was a little late coming to Mormon history, so I missed some stuff. So here I was kind of working on New Jersey and Pennsylvania. I was aware of kind of the major research, but I hadn't jumped into all the, historical graphical battles and that kind of stuff. And so I was always, even to today, I still kind of feel like I play in a little bit of catch up. A lot of guys, are really interested in this and read all kind of the standard stuff on their missions. I didn't really do that. And so, get into it in my very, very last class. And then I would always kind of read things kind of as needed. And it was sort of catching up on other stuff. Brooke's book, The Refiner's Fire, Making a Mormon Cosmology, 1644 to 1844. I had taken one of my undergrad classes at BYU. I took an English history class. It was like English history up to like 1700. And there is this interesting period, the English Civil War, in the 1640s, in which they relax all their censorship laws, and suddenly you got all these new religions, because you're in the middle of a war that always gets like a whole lot of millennial fervor and stuff. And they relaxed all their laws, and suddenly all these new religions start springing up with all these kind of wild ideas. And the professor even then said, you start seeing some morbid stuff, at this time period. And that really fascinated me. That was like, oh my gosh, let's work on that. Let's trace that. Well, unbeknownst to me, Brooke had made that effort. And so I was in, I think the Borders bookstore back in the day, and going through the Mormon section, and there, I'm like, oh wow, look at this. And even though it was like, 6-8 years old at that point, I remember picking it up and looking at the title, and he's tracing it back to 1644. And I was like, everything I wanted to do, this guy apparently has already done. And,
what's the thesis of that book?
Well, it gets a little complicated. One thing he does tie it back to the radicalism of the English Civil War, right? And so his notion is this religious radicalism. You get kind of this more orthodox Puritanism in New England, but they had a bunch of religious radicals. And if you trace things back to like the English Civil War, you can see it kind of seeping through, and that will kind of seep through the Mormonism, right? And that was interesting to me. And then the other big thing is that he frames it, and this gets really complicated. And I spent most of a ton of my adult life trying to sort out what did this word mean. But he traces this idea of Hermeticism, okay? And I know that gets thrown around with esoteric Christianity a whole lot. Boy, I could go on and on and on about that, because I spent so much time trying to figure out what the heck was that thing. And I've come to the conclusion it's kind of too amorphous to be useful, and that we're really a much better term, even if it isn't exactly the same thing, but it's rather more concrete, be talking about Christian Platonism. Boy, I spent so much working on that.
It's a tough term, because it's like, I think it's like Gnosticism, Freemasonry, Hermeticism. These are all these kind of catch-all terms that mean slightly different things, or mysticism, to different people.
Yeah.
And it depends on, in different groups, not necessarily co-opt, but it they use it in a certain way, and it may be very different than another group. And then there's this kind of fighting of like, well, that's not true. Freemasonry, that's this kind of the whole discussion of the speculative versus, the different types of Freemasonry. But
well, I mean, Hermeticism is even a little more amorphous than those other terms, right? Gnosticism can be somewhat. I mean, Freemasonry at least is, a little bit more of a defined construct. Hermeticism does end up being, that was the thing that I spent again so many years trying to figure out what did that mean, and in time started to realize there's a whole bunch of critics of the term who are like, I mean, what it was really popularized by a scholar on kind of esoteric stuff, an important scholar named Francis Yates, Giordano Bruno, and the something I can't remember what the whole title is. And Brooke for his book drew quite heavily on her construct. The problem is construct. It did move things forward. So that was one thing that my advisors really want to point out, that before Yates, this gets all very complicated. But things that are deemed esoteric, there's one of the best books on this. I don't know if you know Wouter Hanegraaff, but that's his book on all this is the best in my opinion, called Esotericism in the Academy. Is outstanding. That's the one that I really feel like kind of finally righted the ship. And it's really, really good. But problem is all these things are a little hard to define, and then we have this modernism problem of, as we entered through kind of these two massive thought revolutions, the Reformation and the Enlightenment, there was this this huge process of basically figuring out what right thinking was, right, and casting off the bad thinking of the past, and it ended up really obscuring the way we would view the past, because there was such this notion of good, modern, logical, correct, versus this benighted superstitious thing that we don't want to be anymore. And so all these terms in esotericism tended to be things that want to be cast off, and we ended up with all this jumble of terms that ended up being a little bit problematic from a scholarly point of view, because they were deemed things that you do not want to be. You don't want to be magical. You don't want to be superstitious. You don't want to be occult, right? And so these terms that all the things you don't want to be ended up not only being rather amorphous, but stupid and ignorant, and something that we smart people don't do. It's the thing that the foolish people of the past think, and it really ended up kind of obscuring things. Yates was kind of an attempt forward of saying, hey, look, yes, we go through the scientific revolution in which, these older ways of thinking get kind of cast off. And then we have a hard time going back and looking at when things that we considered magic, right, were actually, the top leading thinkers thought in those terms, right? We have a hard time processing that. She kind of proposed a way forward, and it was important, but she ended up being a little too amorphous. Sorry if that's probably a little vague, but like I said, I spent a lot of time kind of sorting through that. And again, some of the big problems that Yates had with her term Hermeticism was she made the argument that there was this big sea change in European thought when what's his name, Ficino, the guy who translated all the Plato stuff, the Renaissance scholar. Well, he also translated the Corpus Hermeticum. She made this argument that was like this massive change, and everyone suddenly started thinking Hermetic. Like, there's no validity to that whatsoever. And one of the big problems is that tons of stuff that were deemed Hermetic, it was just everything that was kind of, esoteric or occult. It became this catch-all term for everything like that. Well, a very, very small percentage of those things are actually in the Corpus Hermeticum, right? There's no mention of alchemy or astrology and in that. And but it was just like, let's just throw everything in there, And so even the point of like, well, what really changed? They're very esoteric writings that will really have very little influence. They're kind of interesting, I guess, but really nothing compared to what Ficino was actually working on, which was Plato. But there's sort of this notion of, well, Plato, we got to hold him up as good and logical and legit, and so there's got to be some sort of difference here between Platonism, and esotericism. And again, all those boundaries ended up being very, very problematic. And anyway, that whole discussion. I'm sorry, the viewers may not make much sense of what I'm talking about. But
one thing that's been interesting for me, kind of touching on what you're saying about this idea of like, we need to evolve from the past and looking back and thinking of like, oh, these silly people that believed in these gods or whatnot. For me, I think you're probably, if you listen to some of my stuff, familiar with, my focus on kind of this mystical experience that is starting to be a little more defined with the research into psychedelics, but showing that, whether it's psychedelics, whether it's meditation, or it's religious experiences of like Giordano Bruno or these other religious mystics, there's so much overlap. It's kind of a destination. Doesn't so much matter if you get there by car or walking or plane, that experience that humans are capable of has this, it is something in and of itself that's somewhat independent from the pathway there. So when I had some of these experiences, endogenously, so not through, I wasn't meditating, didn't do any psychedelics. It was just kind of my life being overhauled, the divorce and moving cross country and getting into therapy and learning more about philosophy. Had some of these experiences, not full blown ones, but things that I'd never experienced before. Realizing like, oh, there's an experience that you get this sort of gnosis that is ineffable. Like it's not, you can't really describe it in words. You can kind of come back from it and then sort of piece together the best way to describe it. But realizing that there's this experience that I could have, and it wasn't from like reading books, and it wasn't from like logical thinking, and then realizing that like, we haven't evolved genetically that much for thousands and thousands of years. So like the people 2,000, 4,000 years ago, they were having the same experience and accessing the same information, really made me just kind of revamp the whole way I looked at history, from thinking like, oh, these people, they didn't know like modern science, they didn't know this and that, and so like they had these antiquated ideas. But instead I realized like, oh, they were accessing the same experience that kind of served as the underpinning for my scientific understanding and philosophical understanding. And then you do see that like in Buddhism and Taoism and all of these Eastern philosophies, there's a lot of overlap with principles in quantum physics. And, Schrodinger, one of the fathers of quantum physics, was very into these ideas. So I think that paints a different picture where, you really can go pretty far astray if you have this idea that like, oh, we understand things so much better, because of our technology and because of our advances. You miss a lot of these truths that pop up using different terms, using different frameworks, but there's a lot of overlap, I think, in these different traditions. And then people adopt a term, esotericism, Hermeticism, Freemasonry, they kind of align with what makes the most sense to them, but you start to see that all of these things are kind of built around some kind of core experience, some idea of gnosis.
Yeah, and that would be even kind of at the heart of what you might see as something of a transition with the Enlightenment. Because that earlier notions of science often would have an aspect of, gaining knowledge through this, whatever terms you want to use, gnosis or something, right? A kind of revelatory experience. The person who truly prepared themselves spiritually, we get in touch with these kinds of things, and that true higher wisdom, only the truly enlightened adepts, would have access to it. That, of course, is kind of an anathema to our scientific thinking these days, certainly. But there's also, I found some interesting stuff as we had talked, because this is my advisor was kind of more into brain science stuff, so would have me read some of that, things that would apply it to history. But yeah, this idea of, and I suppose you would know more about this and that kind of thing, but that, have we cut ourselves off from other ways of knowing, because we have this, whatever the term you want to use, scientism or materialism or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I view it sort of as like a traumatic response, kind of an overcorrection from religion, some of the dogmas of religion, where like, we're not going to believe in those things. Like, we're only going to believe in the things that we can prove objectively, and just really disregard the observer. Science really has tried to get to a point where the observer is not part of the equation. The act of perception, the interpretation of what you're seeing, doesn't play into the equation. But we're, kind of running into, we have this crisis in science now because we don't know what the hell consciousness is. And now we're faced with AI. We have this quantum physics where there are radically different interpretations. Some people going one way with it, and the others, we don't care about the philosophical implications. Just the equations work, so just shut up and calculate. So I do view it as kind of this overcorrection, and it worked really well. But now we have to kind of circle back and figure out some of, what it means to be conscious, what our personal experience has to say about the world, about reality.
Anyway, I don't know if I fully finished your question, getting into the Plato stuff. That actually came very, very late in the process for me. I didn't like philosophy. I purposely avoided it. We had so didn't do any of that with undergrad, none as an undergrad or getting my master's in history. Getting into religious studies, they had us take what they call these 4 core classes. So you did one on like sociology of religion, and one was on philosophy of religion, and one was on phenomenology, these 4 kinds of things. And the second class, was notoriously very, very difficult. Professor he had no sympathy for people who didn't have any background in philosophy. The Plato thing came very, very late in the process. In fact, even all of my advisors and stuff, and even kind of my plan was to actually focus a little bit more on arguing of Mormonism as sort of pulling on folk religion that had kind of a Catholic undertone to it. And I do a little bit with that. But it actually happened, what we do, I think that's pretty common in the humanities. You do all these reading exams. You read a whole bunch of books, and then this is kind of your final test before you write your dissertation. So I did all these reading exams on various topics that interested me in the history of Christianity. And it was then that it hit me. not interested in philosophy. Really, never read any Plato. I'd only heard these, kind of little summations that you sometimes get in classes. And what was happening? I read my So I had one. I did one on early Christianity, one on medieval Christianity, focusing on particular topics that interested me. Right. So early Christianity, medieval Christianity, English Reformation, and then one I did with my advisor, kind of religion and the Enlightenment. And what happened is, as I went through that, it just jumped out at me in every single time period that the Christians who because I was always very interested in tracing these Mormon ideas, right? And so anytime I'd see something that looked Mormon, that always really fascinated me. Well, when I did that exam, and again, I hadn't really put this together before this, but I'm reading all this stuff. In every time period, the Christians who sounded Mormon were the Christian Platonists, and that was every time period, and it was really distinct. And so I got kind of towards the end of the exams, and I went to my advisor who was helping me with early Christianity. I had taken I wanted to know a little more about that. I figured that was maybe a little far flung if I'm working on Mormonism, what I do in early Christianity, right? And so I remember taking a class from her and kind of wasn't super into it until she got to the Neoplatonists, and suddenly I was like, "Whoa, these guys sound kind of Mormon." Anyway, but then I went and did this exam with her. I said, "Okay, I want to sort out all these terms. What's Hermeticism? What's Gnosticism? What's Neoplatonism?" I mean, let's kind of that was kind of what I did sort of the exam, and so she let me read all this stuff. And it was a little tough because I didn't really have a ton of background in it. And
what is Neoplatonism? Like, is there Neoplatonism, Platonism, like what? Because I'm not familiar with.
Oh, okay. So they are, and again, it's a touch of a misnomer. They're later Platonic philosophers starting around 200 A.D. Question: why call them Neoplatonists? Well, because they were deemed important, and so their work survived, and so there was always kind of a distinction, right? So I spent all this time like studying in different time periods, people talking about these guys, right? Oftentimes, so like in the 1600s, they would call them the New Platonics, that kind of thing. So you had these important philosophers around 200 to 400 A.D. Okay, and we have their writings. The thing is that the guys before them, I guess, were deemed not very important. So Plato, dies around, I don't know, the 3 something BC, right? So there's a gap there of 500 years, something like that, and there's Platonic philosophers in between him and the Neoplatonists, but they were just deemed not all that important, and so we don't have a lot. We don't have as many of their writings, right? So the guy who really kind of kicks off the greater and important of later Platonic thinkers is a guy named Plotinus, who then has a series of pupils who are also considered important. So that we have this corpus of these Platonic thinkers, say from 200 to 500, and they saw Plato as a religion, which is, again, I think is actually the correct way to view Plato. There was a real move in later Christian thinkers to be like, we need to separate that out, because if you see Plato as religious, then you will be corrupted by his false religion. And literally, they wanted to shut down all the Mormon-looking stuff in Plato, because Plato is very Mormon-looking.
Did Plotinus have a method of accessing some mystical experience through lying in a dark cave for days? Am I remembering that correctly?
I don't know all the ins and outs of that. He definitely...
Okay, I'll have to look up later, but I think I remember hearing that, like, this is Plotinus's method of, like, accessing this other space was...
Yeah. I mean...
sensory deprivation.
And in the broader sense, very much into esoteric, Plato was. Plato made that really clear of wanting the ascent. I mean, that's what the allegory of the cave's about, right? The ascent of the soul to this higher state. Mm-hmm. And so they took Plato, they treated it as very religious. They really expanded on a whole bunch of stuff. They made it a lot more complicated. And another thing that not all of these guys were involved in, but some of them, was Theurgy, and they saw it as kind of a sacred initiation rite. So it's a little foggy exactly what it was, but it was these rituals to which you would obtain more power and become godlike.
What kind of connections with the Eleusinian mysteries
yeah,
are there, or is there
probably
theorized to be?
Yeah, probably. They probably viewed it as sort of like a mystery rite, but it was probably smaller kind of a private thing. There's anyway, yeah. There's other kind of smaller mystery rites. Oftentimes, if you get kind of like a smallest group, then that's like magic. If it's bigger, then it's like mystery. You were. The belief is that you through those rites they acquired divine kinds of powers and could control weather and that kind of stuff, right? So that's the Neoplatonists, and they there's always been this is another kind of long topic, but just this weird love-hate relationship with Plato and Christianity. And it was big in early Christianity, the conflict, right? Some liked him, some hated him, right? And it really gets big in the Enlightenment, to the point that the leading Christian philosophers and historians, a lot of these German scholars who were very good scholars, I mean, incredibly well learned, devoted their whole life to trying to crush Christian Platonism. And it's so interesting because they go through and they really, really describe, the terribleness of, and which they simply equated with Christian mysticism. And so they would go through and they would lay out all these principles that were just so awful, and they're basically just listing off Mormon principles. Of course, they were doing this before Joseph Smith, but Joseph Smith had access to these books. In fact, owned one of the most prominent one that did this, right? And so, in a lot of ways, they literally traced out the history of Christian esotericism, mysticism, Platonism, whatever you want to call it. That again, one of the most prominent book was extremely popular was Mosheim's Institute's Ecclesiastical History, which really, really goes through in tremendous detail on all these groups. And it's constantly hitting on these terrible, terrible principles. And again, it's like Mormonism, right? Is if only Mosheim could have lived to see Joseph Smith, because he would have.
And what are the topics that they focus on the most? I don't know if you know who Terence McKenna is, but I had an episode earlier on where Eldon and I kind of comment on a talk by Terence McKenna where he was talking about Hermeticism versus Christianity. One of the key differences is that kind of in Judeo-Christian teachings, there's this fallen man and sinful man, whereas in Hermeticism it's kind of this idea of like theurgy or becoming co-creators, becoming the divine. And I think that, to me at least, seems like one of the most offensive things maybe about mysticism, Hermeticism, as well as like with Mormonism. That's typically what incites the most pushback, I think, for mainstream Christianity, is this idea like, becoming like gods, like you're storming the throne. So what were the main, ideas that were so offensive to Christians throughout history?
Well, certain Christians, right? the anti-Platonists, right? Which is a kind of orthodoxy, right? There was uneasiness with deification. Plato was certainly interpreted as having a process of becoming like God, pre-existence was bothered a lot of people because Plato. Again, just to be clear, I flat out am arguing in my book, Joseph Smith read Plato. Okay, so it's not coincidental that that there's all this Mormon stuff, because again, Plato flat out lays out the Mormon plan of salvation is very clearly laid out in Plato. Okay. And that will never be taught in any university. That just doesn't get taught. There's been this move of, we have to strip out all the religious stuff out of Plato, because again, this goes back to these German scholars, right? Because otherwise Plato's dangerous, and if you don't strip out all this religious stuff, then you're going to turn into a Christian Platonist, and you'll believe in pre-existence. It's and I know that sounds silly, but it's literally true. Again, there's this anyway. So they really pushed that it was terrible to say that the soul was uncreated, which again Joseph Smith specifically says in the King Fall Discourse. Mm-hmm. Not only does he say it, he literally uses the words that the critics were using to attack Plato. He literally uses the same phrases. Okay, and so his point is, he's embracing this. And again, I went over that in one of the presentations I did for Trevor, right? That this is this notion of this fuller truth, which is called either the ancient religion, the ancient theology, right? That there's this bigger truth that had been lost to the world. And I would actually say Joseph Smith got a point there. And so the idea is that, and this was debated in early Christianity too, right? That if you say that human souls were uncreated, you are making them too much like God, because only God should be the eternal, mm-hmm. forever and ever. So this actually, I mean, even in like the 2nd century, you see this come up with Justin Martyr, right? This comes up very, very early, of Justin Martyr being told he's a Platonist, and he's being told, no, that's so arrogant. You need to be saved by Jesus, right? Don't think that you've like got this internal innate divinity within you. That's wicked. Mm-hmm. Only Jesus can do that kind of thing, right? The argument was that Plato thinks that you kind of have this natural ability that if you foster it and you live the right lives and all this stuff, then you can ascend back to heaven. I mean, Justin Martyr in his conversion story literally lays all that out, that he was trying to do that. He was seeking to see God. And then he meets a Christian and says, no, man cannot see God, right? Because only a wicked Platonist would think such a thing, that you would be so arrogant to think that you could, right?
This is the same divide now. I consider myself spiritual, not religious at all, but a lot of kind of new age ideas. But I blend science and philosophy and just a whole bunch of different things. I view it all as mythology. But there are a lot of people within what I consider spirituality that they do really identify with a lot of Christ teachings, but they don't view Christ as a savior or somebody that is like redeeming us from sin. They talk about like Christ consciousness being a state of consciousness, a state of being that he had, that we all are meant to experience, this oneness. And the atonement, Garden of Gethsemane, that would be viewed as like this mystical experience. It does have a lot of overlap with this mystical experience of transcending time and space and immense suffering and like kind of feeling everything. And so it sounds like a similar divide where, there are people that are like, no, Christ is the savior. You are sinful. He's the only way through his atonement, something that he did. It's the only way that you can get back to God, versus a bunch of other people that are like, oh, I get some stuff out of the Bible and Christ, but it's more a mystical Christ. It's not that he is needed. It's just, he's kind of this archetype of this deification or this achieving oneness. So it sounds like a similar divide.
So the fundamental thing, this shows up in early Christianity and in Joseph Smith's time, right? That the feeling was this was orthodoxy, right? The orthodoxy was a fundamental difference between God and man, right? Fundamental difference between God and man. You can be saved by Jesus, but you don't become like God, right? And the whole notion is man's humility and their abjectness, right? And a lot of people will point to Augustine as the one who really wants to point out, original sin isn't just the fall, isn't just sinfulness, but it's this really fundamental brokenness in us that is utterly untranscendable except through Jesus, right? And again, these notions would play big into Luther and Calvin, and thus into modern evangelicalism as well, right? This kind of thing. And so, even though Augustine's complicated and stuff, a lot of people, and the irony is Augustine's influenced by Plato, but he really takes a turn against that kind of Platonic thinking with his both attacks on Pelagius and his City of God. He's really wanting to make Christianity different, right? With the utter depravity of humanity. Okay, and that's then again going to have a huge influence on Protestantism. Those aspects of Augustine, right? Isn't tea and tulip of Calvinism total depravity, right? Of humans, there's utterly right. Calvin, huge fan of Augustine, so's Luther, right? Yeah, so there's sort of a clash. There is, a lot of Christian Platonists say, okay, yes, there is a fall, but that state, right? There's always this notion of the Edenic state was this place where people were kind of godlike, and it's recoverable, right? If you do the right things and you're a good Christian and you do something kind of theurgical or whatever it is, right? You can recover that state. And yes, we do have our problems, but we can get back there. And that's often kind of seen as kind of the division. Interestingly, how people view Jesus is another thing that's what I've found is that there's a tradition of Christian mysticism, right? And we sometimes I think we sometimes make the mistake of mysticism as sort of a practice, which it is, of course, but miss that there's doctrinal pieces to it, right? And it tends to be it's a Christian Platonism, okay? And you tend not to get really defined religious sects based around it. Occasionally you do. So it tends to be a little amorphous to trace historically, but you can run into guys who are into it, right? And they influence each other and you can trace it through, right? So I spent a lot of time doing that, right? And in early Christianity, and then this is going to pop up again, starts in the Middle Ages, but then into the early modern period among groups who are seen as like super radical, right? Do adopt kind of what you were describing as some of your associates. There's a different notion of Christ. And again, you can see this among some Gnostics. Again, there's a lot of different kinds, so I want to be careful not to lump them all together. But of this idea that Jesus is kind of like you're saying, Jesus is the way shower. They interpret it in a very Platonic way. Gnostics tend to be very Platonic, right? Jesus is a special person. He's this way shower, and but we can all imitate him, right? You got to be good, got to be really good like Jesus was, right? But that whatever Jesus does, we can do. And my argument is Joseph Smith is absolutely saying that, particularly in D&C 93, he makes it quite clear. And that it's less of a being rescued by, his pain and suffering, but that being shown the pathway by the life he leads. Now, again, so you see that in early Christianity, but the interesting thing is that that's going to pop up again among early modern mystics. And it even starts among some medieval radicals as well, right? And there's a train you can trace the influence from guys like Meister Eckhart, and it passes on to these early modern radicals, particularly a group called the Family of Love, which is really interesting, and they have this idea as well, right? That what we're here to do is to imitate Christ, and the early Quakers had this idea very much as well. Now that was seen as very, very heretical. Is one of the reasons why they had lots of reasons why they were heavily persecuted, but that was one of them. One of their leaders. This happens, I think, in 1656. A guy named James Naylor rides on a donkey into Bristol, and his followers lay down their cloaks and shout, "Holy, holy, holy!" Right, and it freaks the authorities out. They're calling this guy Jesus, and his claim was, "Well, yeah, the Christ Spirit lives within me, right? I've achieved this state," and they're just like, "Ah!" I mean, this is just like, and his followers are saying they're ready to die for him, and this kind of thing, and so they beat him, they bore his tongue, they brand him with a bee, and they throw him in jail, right? And he gets out and he dies afterwards, right? But and I won't go into all this, the ins and outs of this, but all that kind of stuff ends up being the things that I argue. I'm arguing that the major source that Joseph Smith draws on, it looks to me, is the writings of an English mystic named Jane Lead. That stuff ends up having a really big influence on her, and she really, really promotes humans can become. She even uses the word Christ plural, right? Humans can become this, and it's something that
she was in Philadelphia. Is that correct?
Her group was called the Philadelphians. I suppose that's a little confusing. No, she's English.
Oh,
she dies
okay.
in 1704, and I spent all this time tracing her influence. That would probably get a little tedious, but tremendously Mormon looking stuff. Anyway, that has a major influence on her, and she really, really pushes deification, like, I mean, as much as, I mean, more than Joseph Smith would, I would say. It's anyway. So sorry to get off on all that, but yeah, there's actually this mystic tradition of, and they really, really push. In fact, Jane Lead's mentor, a guy named John Portage, he gets brought up on charges in like the 1640s for disparaging, like atonement, right? And saying this is nonsensical that we're saved this way. But what's interesting is that the Quakers, okay, because the original Quakers kind of thought that way, but then that, after James Naylor really gets the hammer brought down on him, they kind of moderate a bit, right? And there was always this notion kind of hanging over the Quakers is that they don't view Jesus properly. William Penn, one of their real important leaders, even got brought up on trial for being heretical in his views of Christ. What ends up happening, though, is that in the 1820s, right? So jumping ahead, 1820s in America, there's a revival of that kind of older kind of Quaker thinking, and it's pushed by a guy named Elias Hicks, okay? So that in 1825, there ends up being a schism among the Quakers of the more orthodox ones who were like, let's think of Jesus kind of more in a Protestant way. And then Hicks, who promotes this mystical way of, no, Jesus is the way shower. We are all to become him, right? And that was really, the Quakers were really talking about that. I mean, Palmyra had a Quaker meeting. Martin Harris's family were all involved in that kind of thing. And I went and looked at Hicks's writings, and he uses a ton of phrases that show up in D&C 93 about becoming the same kind of person that Christ does. And they even Hicks and Thomas Paine does as well. They really disparage atonement. Hicks's line is no good decent person would accept that kind of offer for someone else to suffer for them. Is the big thing. And Thomas Paine, who actually grew up a Quaker also, uses the same kind of language. I'm sorry, I'm getting off on other stuff, but anyway.
So I've got a question.
Yeah.
So my understanding of Plato would be that he would consider that he's not creating these ideas, this philosophy, but he's kind of downloading it from this perfect form, that it's some other place that he is accessing. So correct me if I'm wrong on that, but if I get him well enough that that is true, would that not also be the case with Joseph Smith, with all these other people, in that they don't have to directly be influenced by Plato to have these similar insights and similar ideas? And the way I see this, appearing now is that, I mean, you've read some of the stuff that I've posted in the group, and you're like, oh, those are really, Platonic ideas. But I don't read Plato, and these are all things that I've kind of accessed in, just this way of thinking that end up aligning so much. So it's not a direct influence. Similarly, I have a lot of friends or read people that, whether it's through a near-death experience or they're an atheist, they'll believe anything spiritual, and then they try psilocybin or something, and they have these, they walk away from that experience, believing in past lives, believing in pre-existence, in these very, what you would probably consider Platonic ideas. Again, not from a direct influence, but they come away from an experience with these ideas. How much does it have to be directly, historically coming from Plato versus people accessing it in the same way that Plato did? I know that's speculation, but
no, I understand it, and yeah, I remember you brought that up a couple of times, so I've been thinking about that as we're getting ready to have this interview. All right, I would kind of, as I'm thinking about this, break things into two categories, which I think are probably a little hard to fully demarcate from each other. All right, let's start with the experience category. I don't spend. I'm not a real expert on this, but again, book. I think I even have it up. Maybe I should find the title to get it right. It was really interesting that my advisor had me read. Oh, here it is. Edward Beaver's The Realities of Witchcraft and Popular Magic in Early Modern Europe, Culture, Cognition, and Everyday Life. Came out in 2008 from Palgrave Macmillan. Recommend it. It's interesting. So in that, he had talked about, I guess my advisor recommended it because it did the kind of stuff she likes, using the brain science stuff to look at history. And so again, I skimmed through it really quickly. I was trying to find the term, but he uses, I think we had talked about it earlier in the conversation that these brain scientists or anthropologists, whatever, have found these cross-cultural experiences, right? Kind of transcendent things, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, shamanistic type states. These are the things. Seeing the dead is another one that he puts in there, right? And so, and then I would again, I don't know how to categorize it, but in terms of the mystical experience, and I know that that's a little amorphous. Maybe we wanted to find that more clearly, but being one of those cross-cultural experiences, right? In other words, yeah. So that humans can have these experiences, and that within those mystical, near-death experience would be another one, right? And and again, this is not my expertise, but that within those experiences, and I'll defer to you who've studied this more, right? There are these tendencies of things you take away from it, right? And as I understand it, and sorry if this is overly simplified, feeling like that some of these Christian esoteric tendencies and doctrines are things that you felt somewhat convinced by your own experiences. Is that do you want to?
Yeah, a lot of these, just kind of oneness, the gnosis, like not an intellectual knowing, but just this kind of ineffable, deeper knowledge experience, kind of transcendence of time and space, and people.
So,
experience past lives or remember or whatnot. You know, a lot of these similar ideas, regardless of kind of what culture they come from, and some cross cultural experiences too of like Christian seeing Hindu gods and whatnot. But
all right. So I can understand. I can understand experiences like that, particularly if you have like a near-death experience or something where it's really, which I've not had, but really can be quite involved for some people, right? Um, but yeah, kind of that mystical experience of what you're describing as the oneness and that kind of thing, right? That then leads you to kind of think about reality in certain kinds of ways. And if I'm not mistaken, maybe even giving you kind of some grounds to kind of think about Plato's cave, right?
mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I would kind of say it's sort of twofold, right? So having these powerful experiences, I mean, near death experience as well, right? Plato, one of his most important statements about the afterlife that he gives is in Book 10 of the Republic, in which he cites out the near death experience of somebody, a soldier named Eros, right? And again, you always wonder like how accurate was the anyway. It's hearsay, whatever. Who knows? But it's interesting because I mean Eros's experience got a ton of Mormon stuff in it. I would even say it's got a lot of stuff that you see in the Book of Revelation. I'm guessing that Plato's telling of Eros's story had a massive influence on religion, Western religion, right? It's quite an important story. And yet, I would also say we don't. Okay, but there's a tremendous amount of cultural influence we all have, though, right? Right. So, my argument is you got a lot of Christian Platonism if you're a Mormon, right? That's my whole argument, right? Again, the whole plan of salvation, which again I think is quite a compelling way to view the world. That's all Platonic, right? And my argument is, yeah, Joseph Smith gets that from there. Again, he puts it in the words of other people, like a huge part of the plan of salvation. Again, we put up all our map, and then if you stop and think, okay, well, what are the scriptural references to that? You kind of have to piece it together from a handful of Joseph Smith revelations, right? A big one is Abraham 3, right? When the pre-existence in Abraham. Well, that Abraham 3 is clearly an adaptation of Plato's Timaeus. The same stuff goes in the same order, right? Joseph Smith looks like he's clearly using it, and there'd be reasons why he would even think that would be something that would come from Abraham, because yada yada. It's always Plato's not the originator of this stuff. This is much more ancient tradition, and it's kind of nice to take a Platonic idea and say it actually came from some biblical patriarch, right? But I mean, so that we have a lot of Platonic ideas as Mormons without reading any Plato. You know what I mean? And so there's some context for some of those aspects being interpreted, in Mormon ways, which can then line up with Plato. Anyway, it's hard. It's like I said, it's hard to totally divorce, your
yeah.
yeah.
I think it's hard because like you're looking at things from a historical perspective, which that says the tools that you use are like linear time and causality through like time and space, and what's off limits is kind of the metaphysical explanations or anything outside of that. And I think you can piece things together and be right in a lot of things, but yeah, I think there's a lot of things that you would consider Plato, Platonic, yet came before Plato. I mean, I don't know if Lao Tzu and Taoism, I think that's maybe 500 BC, but there's a lot of these similar ideas in that before. So I think that's what's tricky is teasing out like, well, how much of it is kind of this lateral or horizontal transmission through people reading this and that, and how much of it is this kind of vertical transmission from this kind of perfect form of philosophy that, you know, that Plato was accessing and downloading himself. Because you do see this in a lot of experiences now where people go from atheism to now they're channeling some book from some entity that refers to themselves as Jesus, and now it's the Course of Miracles, and you know, so many people follow it, and it's very esoteric in its ideas. So you have a lot of instances, I think, where you see these esoteric ideas, but they're somebody has them from just an experience, and they walk away from an experience, whether it's a near-death experience or psychedelic experience, and they come back with like, hey, I know this about reality. So it's yeah, I think it's interesting. It's difficult to figure out, to try to explain things from just one aspect. And I think that's what I see people struggle with, is like, oh, you know, Mormonism, it's all Freemasonry. And somebody else is like, oh, Mormonism, it's all Kabbalah. And Mormonism, it's Plato. Mormonism, it's psychedelic. When really, I think the reality of it is that it's kind of a mix of all of those things. And those things all have this kind of overlap of kind of this core truth or phenomena that ties those together.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a big, I guess, again, you know, I'm going to put out kind of my, and again, it's taken a long time, and I've just got off on another rabbit hole that looks pretty fruitful, but it's going to slow me down a little bit. That happens. That's been going on for 10 years. Again, I would be proposing some things that, I don't know, I guess they could be, if we think, you know, very, very binary kinds of ways might seem somewhat contradictory. I know that you're against that kind of thinking, so it wouldn't be too.
I mean, I think that's actually, like, for me, it was really facing the binary, seeing the two sides of the paradox, where then things really pop into like another dimension. Like when you see the tail side of the coin, and then for some reason, then you see the head side of the coin, and they seem contradictory. They seem like a paradox until you finally realize, like, oh, this is just two-dimensional thinking, and there's another dimension there. Which I think, going back to the allegory of the cave, you know, it's when you're sitting on one maybe end of the row of prisoners, and you're seeing the shadows all present in one way, and then for some reason you're placed on the other end of the line of prisoners, and then you see all those same shadows but from a different perspective, and then integrating those two kind of paradoxical views, and you start to think about, is there a fire, are there objects, and looking at kind of a meta reality.
Well, why would we, again, you know, you've seen some of my presentations, you're probably aware of this, right? My argument is that I do believe that Joseph Smith had access to the ideas he presents in Mormonism, which again do tend to be apart from you know, Orthodox Protestantism. So Mormonism does look, you know, pretty different. And the question is, you know, how's he come up with this stuff when he's you know, limited education farm boy? And you know, people have been working at this, and I have also. And then again, you know, so you know, kind of map out where I think it looks like it comes from, and so the argument is going to be that he had access to this in books, and I know that you know, can seem as kind of a deconstructing kind of thing, whatever, you know, or attack on the faith, and again, you know, thought I don't know, go over my own spiritual experiences, because you know, I'm practicing Mormon and got released as bishop last year. So have done that experience too. And I'm, you know, kind of
how How has it? So you consider yourself you're an active
Yeah,
practicing
yeah.
Mormon.
I was just a bishop last year. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, why don't you
And on,
speak to that? Like how has how has this, not been like a deconstruction, but how has it impacted your faith, spirituality? Yeah, for some people it could be um, challenging of like, oh, these aren't Joseph Smith's ideas, they're just Plato's ideas. But it doesn't seem like it's gone that direction for you.
yeah, no, and I'd again, maybe I would maybe start by framing how I currently view things. And again, this is a long process, right? So that word "just" I always want to look out for, right? Like, and although again, yeah, to even to back up a little bit, right? My argument is that all the stuff that he puts out, I am of the belief, and people can fire back at me, but I'm of the belief that every this is maybe an obnoxious thing to say, but I'm of the belief you can give me any idea that Joseph Smith that we would think of as distinctively Mormon coming from Joseph Smith, and I literally believe I can get you the quote, and that would apply to everything, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Book of Abraham, and it's so why be a Mormon if that's how I view it, right? Um, and one is my belief in some of the really push is that there are those statements of DNC 88 about truth coming by study and faith, and I believe that's in fact if the publisher will let me, that's the title I want to use. Is that's kind of the summary. It's not it's both of these things, and that he absolutely believed in having transcendent experiences, but that there was a context to him too. He didn't always tell us the context. is my argument. That yeah, he knew about stuff, but he focused more on the on that spiritual, the spiritual theophany stuff, because that's makes better story, I guess. Sorry if I don't mean it. I hope that doesn't sound anyway, but yeah, I mean a couple of things. One, I believe, and this gets a little complicated. One, I believe the way you put together, I believe historically it's very, very interesting, because I do think that there really is as I've kind of addressed here a little bit. I know it's kind of complicated, but there really is a Christian mystical Platonic tradition, right? That Joseph Smith's drawing on that's interesting. I do think that there's cases to be made for an interesting way to view early Christianity in those terms. Not as there's Protestants really want to come out and say anything Platonic that shows up in Christianity is a corruption. I've talked with Trevor about this, and maybe this is because I'm not a biblical scholar and stuff, but I'm always remember mentioning this to Trevor that the first Platonizer of Christianity was Jesus, in my opinion. There's I think there's quite a lot of similarities there, and so this notion of good Judaism and wicked Greek thought is I just think it's just ridiculous. It just has no bearing in reality whatsoever. Jesus, in my opinion, sounds a lot more like the Greek philosophers than he does like Old Testament prophets, in my opinion. That's how it looks to me.
Yeah, it's funny. I've thought similar things about I think if Jesus came back today, he'd look a lot more like Buddhist than he would Christian. At least from our definition of mainstream Christianity. I think there's a lot of
certainly
what I
similarities
see
there.
as
So, but yeah, again, obviously, I think as much as we try to say, oh, the Old Testament and the New Testament, they're just harmonized. I don't think they do, and I think that's just the theological games we like to play. Again, I know other people have more expertise in this than I do, but that's my opinion. So yeah. Anyway, I do think that Joseph Smith is what I would kind of argue, and I went over in one of the presentations I give. There is this notion of, hey, there's this fuller ancient truth that Protestants have rejected, and look how great it is, and it has lots of Mormon doctrine in it, right? And to me, I kind of having been a practicing Mormon the whole time, I kind of was like, okay, that's cool. That's what feels like what I'm doing. And and I liked Plato, and it felt like it enhanced my religious view. I feel like Plato's allegory of the cave had a massive influence on Joseph Smith. I'm arguing that his 1832 first vision account was essentially a kind of a reworking of Plato's cave, and that you see Plato's cave in other places like DNC 88 as well. And to the point that yeah, I think that Plato massive, he interpreted it in a particular kind of way. And I like all this stuff. I liked my Mormon doctrine; it lines up and that kind of thing. Again, it's I've had a bit of a long journey, but the thing is that, and I've talked to some people about this as well. It was always, in my experience, and obviously everyone's experience can vary a little bit. But if we were to take, say, perhaps something like a something somewhat stereotypical faith crisis in Mormonism, right? You start to kind of wonder about stuff. You read a little more. You're down the rabbit hole. Oh my gosh, why did I never hear about this? Everyone's lying to me. I try to go talk to people. No one will. No one has answers. Not atypical. Of things that we hear, and I definitely have friends and stuff who have gone through that, and it's it's pretty jarring. One of the things I sort of pointed out is the guys who get into Mormon history for its own sake, not as a deconstructing their faith, right? Because they find the topic interesting. There does tend to be a transition because you learn about messiness, right? But a couple of things happen. One, you kind of have like a support group, right? And of all these guys who've gone before, and you admire, and you realize that most of them stuck with the faith. And so Mormon History Association, whatever, these there's kind of there's sort of a support group with a whole lot of people kind of stay in, and so there's a I explain this to a lot of people. There's kind of a general process for guys who get into that, even if there is some discomfort and some jarring, but it's not, they tend not to go through that kind of really extreme faith crisis, because I don't know, there's more context, there's more support, there's more there's all this kind of stuff. Now they will often end up being different sort of Mormon, because some of the I don't know if I love this word, but some of the myths that we always throw around in church, probably aren't accurate, like true doctrine never changes, yada yada yada, all this stuff. You'll all this, you'll know things are messier than that. But so yeah, I mean, my own experience, had to wrestle with a lot of things, certainly, but yeah, it was just sort of steps at a time, and even early on, just getting more and more comfortable. Gosh, it was probably 20 years ago where I decided, after having, because I was always super interested in tracing Mormon ideas, and then this is probably more than 20 years ago when I would have problems, right? So I'd look up, oh, okay, something's interesting. I would kind of follow it down, and then find more and more Mormon stuff. And then if it was some ideas that were Joseph Smith could have had access to, then I'd be like, kind of freaked out, and I would have I've described this story a few times, but I would refer to myself as having like mini faith crises, like. But I was like constantly doing it because this is what fascinated me, right? And I was like, and then I'd be like, oh, too close, and I sort of had to kind of get to the point of like, am I constantly doing this, right? And I got to the point that I decided, it's all good, I'm not bothered by anything whatsoever. And I had kind of a funny experience when in 2008. Richard Bushman, he had held a lot of these seminars of grad students he would bring in to help him do research he wanted to do on rough stone rolling. And then when he finished it, he felt really inundated by everybody's like historical faith crises. Everyone would be going to him, right? Because they would learn new stuff in his book, and they'd want to talk about it. And he'd be, he was kind of overwhelmed. He was a very big seller, right? So he couldn't talk to everybody, right? So he was feeling a little irritated, apparently, like, why don't we have better ways to deal with us within the institutional church, like, seminary institute teachers and that kind of stuff. So he wanted to do a thing where they would get better trained to talk about this. I don't know if that ever really went anywhere, but he put up one seminar to try to think about getting it going, and I applied to that. He let me in. So we took hot topics, and we were all going to write about it, and and try to be a little more conciliatory, not as combative. So I want to take that issue of parallels, right? This is the thing I wanted to do, and he was like, "No, I want you to research something you're not an expert on." Okay, so I took Swedenborg, right? It was like, which was basically to do the same thing, and he realized I tried to kind of go around it. But it was funny because when I did Swedenborg, I basically said, "Who cares if you read Swedenborg, right? Like, so what?" And it was funny because I was the youngest guy in the group, and so they literally, so we were like presenting our papers. That's literally, basically what I said. I'd say a little more than that, but that was the gist. And they like grilled me for an hour, saying, "Can't be that simple." And I'm like, "Oh, but it is." Because I sort of got to the point where I was like, so what? Now, there have been times, and I know you probably got to run pretty soon, but where I was thinking a little bit about this, right? And we'll maybe get off on, we were going to maybe talk about my story. I guess we ended up talking about my research, but throughout all this, there have been, talking about spiritual experiences. Maybe we'll do that maybe another time. But there's been a lot of these, right? I felt prompted to go to grad school. I felt prompted to do things. I felt, it's been this winding road and confusing at times and challenging at times and stuff. But there's always kind of been this thing of, stick with Mormonism, make sense of things. And I feel like I did. But occasionally there'd be these times, I don't know what, for some reason I thought of this. There's this, I haven't seen this movie for a long time, but there's a scene in the original Naked Gun movie that came out in the mid 80s of Frank Drebin's out walking around, he's this cop, and he's got this, interior dialogue of all these things he's thinking about, trying to crack the case. And then in the very end, he goes, "Where the hell was I?" Right? Because he'd be walking around, he's in the middle of nowhere, right? And there's been times where I kind of felt like that, where I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Where have I ended up? Right? Like, I'm an odd Mormon, and my views have put me to a place where I'm quite different from all kinds of people. It's always felt like a spiritual process to get there, but then it's like, it's the whole notion of being, you're part of the group or you're not. And not only sometimes feeling like maybe not so much, but also, again, there's always the uneasiness I've had with the book coming out of upsetting people. And so that's its own kind of long story. And so there have been moments of wait, where have I ended up? And truth be told, that's literally how I was feeling when they called me as bishop, right? Of whoa. There was, anyway, I told you I did some blog posts recently at Times of Seasons on some of that. So I know you probably got to go pretty soon. That's its own huge topic, but
I think it this kind of comes down to what we were talking about with Hermeticism of like how you define it. If you look at Mormonism, it seems like you're holding to Mormonism as this kind of like the perfect form of like the objects and the fire and not the shadows. If you look at how Joseph Smith and Brigham Young defined Mormonism as like, it's just truth from whatever source it comes from. And the great thing about Mormonism is that you can believe whatever's true. You don't have a dogma that tells you what not to. Like if you define Mormonism that way, I definitely still be considered a Mormon. But there are other people that no, Mormonism is what the prophets and the apostles, the current prophets and apostles teach, and these are the doctrines, and whatnot. So people have very different views of what Mormonism is. And I think, yeah, I mean, Mormonism talks about, how God speaks to different people in different ways, that like Muhammad and all these different spiritual leaders throughout history, they've all been inspired, to the, kind of the extent that they could. And they were called to lead those people to like a higher spiritual understanding. But it kind of leaves out the possibility that like Mormonism as well could be that too, that like maybe we're all prisoners looking at the shadows on the wall. We all have different vantage points. And I think that there are some that, really study it. And then once they've kind of mapped out how the shadows look and appear and what happens when they go over certain parts of the wall, then they start listening to what the other prisoners, what things look like from their perspective. And then they really start to realize like, oh, we're all describing the same thing. And then they start thinking about things kind of, again, the objects in the fire. And then there's that even meta level where, the fire isn't the ultimate source of truth. You get outside and you see the sun. And then, yeah, when you come back down and you try to tell the other prisoners, you sound a little crazy and you're definitely not part of the in-group anymore. But I think that, yeah, I mean, it sounds like, I think what you're doing is really beautiful and important because, yeah, there's a lot of things about, the very little I know about Plato, there are things that really resonate with me. And I definitely feel like my journey has been kind of tapping into the same reservoir of truth that he was, this kind of perfect form. And I see a lot of Buddhism in Mormonism. That was kind of my on-ramp to reconsidering, some of the truth in Mormonism is seeing that overlap. But you're seeing, a lot of overlap with, Neoplatonism and Mormonism. And I think, I think that's an important thing that a lot of people will resonate with. And yeah, I'm fascinated to read the book when it comes out.
When I get there. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It was interesting how you framed it in terms of. I may not get your right wording here, but I'll frame what I took away from what you said of wanting to practice Mormonism as the pure form, I guess you could say. In a lot of ways, I actually do think, and we'll see how this goes. But I think that understanding Plato, and my argument is Joseph Smith's influence by it, will help shed some light on Mormonism, in my opinion. May not be welcomed by a lot of people, but a lot of that has actually come from my own, and again, maybe we can have another conversation at some point, but a lot of spiritual experiences along the way, helping me sort these things out. But I've also had spiritual experiences in which, again, I was listening to some of your couple of your podcasts in which people are, contrasting other kinds of spiritual experiences, maybe, drug induced. I don't know if that's the right word. It's psychedelic induced kinds of things. And it made me think a lot about some of my own. And I would see that mine probably do fit a very kind of Mormon archetype of feeling a prompting, feeling this, feeling some kind of communication. They would fit very Mormon kinds of spiritual experiences, right? Mine have fit pretty well within that. I feel like I've had a lot, but they've also led me to be a bit of a different kind, right? I mean, a whole other topic, but 2008, I felt a really strong a very Mormon kind of spiritual experience to vote no on Proposition 8, right? Not instead of voting yes to say that, no gay marriage, I was to vote no. I felt this. And again, it was a Mormon kind of spiritual experience, but one that was very at odds with Mormon practice. And that was something to sort through. And so I did vote no. And that did cause me to think about Mormonism differently. So that, yeah, I wouldn't define, and this is actually fairly important to me, I do not define, true spiritual practice as simply whatever the leaders say. Now, again, they generally say good things. I'm not against
Mm-hmm.
that, but I don't see that as the definition, right? And yet, I value the organization having leadership, and I value their contribution. That's important, of course. But there's lots of things about Mormonism that I don't define solely as, whatever the leaders say. And again, but also not like hateful or resentful of the leaders, right? Sometimes I was while bishop, but maybe that's a little overstated, but that anyway, that's a whole other story. But yeah, so I've developed a kind of a way of looking at Mormonism, which has kind of integrated all this stuff. And to me, I mean, at least so far, I mean, the fact that I made it through the bishop thing, because that was really hard for me, makes it feel like everything else is pretty smooth sailing. And it also, it's a spiritual thing. I feel like this is where God wants me to be. Now, I'm also open to the idea that, God says something else, then I want to be obedient to that. That's important to me. But I also see lots of going through the process makes me see lots of value. And so I've become convinced that it's a valuable thing. But then there's also, maybe get off on this topic, because I'm putting out something as far as I know, probably be controversial. And I've had people say to me when I describe the process of warnings of church discipline, are you worried about that? And the line I will use is, I don't think that will happen. But if it does, the line I would say is, I've told several people this, if they drag me in front and say, you're out, I will say, okay, well, see you guys Sunday, right? I mean, we can still go back to church, right?
Yeah.
And if I'm cut off from being able to pay tithing and have a calling, that doesn't seem insurmountable. So, and again, I wouldn't necessarily predict the future, but I don't view that as meaning that I go to hell. And again, who knows what path God may have for me. I don't, life's often been surprising, certainly. But like I said, I feel pretty comfortable. I mean, there is some discomfort of me causing other people discomfort, but I've even kind of gotten some comfort with that as well. That's a long process. But anyway, maybe these are some stories from another time. But anyway,
yeah, I appreciate you discussing it, and I think, yeah, in some sense, I think that if you want to think of like what the plan or like what God wants for us, if you're like personifying God, I think in some ways that's what it comes down to, is like trusting your intuition, the spirit, or whatever, that you'll be confronted with situations where, whether it's culture or your parents or your religion or whatnot, will tell you this is the right thing for you to do, for you to vote for, whatever, and you'll be faced with something where you feel like, no, I actually feel like this is what's right for me. And I think in some ways, yeah, that could be the purpose, is, the test of like, will you follow what you feel is right? Listen to that versus just being quote unquote obedient. And so, even though I'm outside of the church, I've come to respect people that are within the church, and that everybody's kind of lifting where they stand in. And I think that building bridges and just having discussion about these things, like even if you don't feel like, entheogens played any role in early Mormonism, like at least discussing it and what the similarities and what the differences are, or, Plato. I think it's very exciting to see just where people are taking things inside the church, outside the church. And for me, it ends up with like a, greater appreciation for some of the things that I do view are true, or, kind of the more beautiful aspects of Mormonism, even despite the fact that there are things that I really struggle with in terms of teachings and how that comes across. So yeah, appreciate your work, and I'll put in the show notes some links to maybe the presentation he gave on Mormonism and Western esotericism, that YouTube video, so they can listen to more of the details on Jane Lead. And so, yeah, thanks for coming on. Good talking to you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.
All right.